I'm making a video game with underwater mechanics. In this DevLog, collision logic updates, level art in music, tutorial rework, localization support, milestones, dialogue system. Last devlog, I showcased a bug with some enemies pushing a player out of bounds. To fix this, I updated all the traps to always ignore collisions while the player is within their collider. When there's groups of traps and the player walks through, the velocity decreases a bit naturally. However, when there's a long collider, the player can still go max speed, which is something I wanted to change. I updated the player script to track whether the player is in a trap or not. Traps set this state while the player is within the trigger collider. Then, I configured an additional movement penalty while within a trap, similar to the encumbered coefficient. After last devlog, I received the music for this world, so it was time to add the final art pieces to each level. I started with the props, importing them into the engine. Then I added one of the props to the prop palette. Since the system is based on components and prefabs, doing this was easy. I imported the rest of the props, added the right metadata, and made sure they were a prefab in order to complete the palette. Before setting up props, I updated the prop component with buttons for common rotations and directions, since I often rotate props around. This really sped up the time needed to decorate each level. I also updated each level to have its own theme song. Here's a small preview of what you can look forward to hearing. To support localization in the game, I used Unity's localization package. I followed their quick start guide and set up my localization settings in a specific folder I named IATnet, which is short for internationalization. Then I created some locales. I'm starting with English and Spanish just so I have something that I can switch to and confirm things work correctly. Since I'm only localizing strings at the moment, I created my first string table. Then I added my first entry. In order to test things, I used a made-up Spanish-sounding word instead of the proper translation. After setting up the build script and changing one of the tap buttons to use a localized string, I had something that worked. During setup, I also learned how to export and import CSVs so I can eventually get translations commissioned and send the CSVs to a translator. Part of my research included figuring out how to be notified when a locale or a string gets updated, which I can do by listening to the onUpdate string event. This will be used to update the text that also use hotkey icons. Having figured all the pieces, it was time to start on all the localization tasks. The first item I tackled was the pause menu, starting with the tabs and subtabs. The first challenging part was the difficulty carousel. I had to update its logic to correlate options with localized strings. Then I wired the carousel to re-render the text when any of the strings receive an updated event. The keyboard and gamepad panels were localized next, since they're just a label and a button. This highlighted an issue with the current panels, which don't have good layout elements and made the longer text squish. I logged a task to address the layout of these panels later. The next piece I localized was the level complete screen, which also just required updating a lot of labels and a few buttons. Then I moved on to the leaderboards, which also had no specialized parts. Afterwards, I localized a part of the game I don't see often, the main menu. Since this uses the pause panel prefab with some hidden buttons, its options panel was localized already. The final scene I needed to localize was the world map. This also made me pick interim names for the final two locations. For the final integration, I worked on allowing the player to change the language. I first did this with a dropdown following the localization package documentation. In order to keep the UI consistent, I created a carousel for switching languages. After showing this off in a community Discord, I got some feedback around displaying the languages in their own language. I had to make a custom component for this change, but it definitely works better. The tutorial needed a minor revamp so it's consistent with the way the game works. I started by reworking its size and where the anchor will be. With a new shape, I added a couple more traps to give the player a chance to practice staying between two traps. Since the player will be going back to the start, I created a system that will let me disable certain hints when they no longer apply. In this clip, the grab chest hint is no longer visible on the return trip. With the same mechanism, I also made the arrow switch to point towards the beginning of the level. Having set up the localization framework, I also localized the tutorial tips, starting with the simple labels. Then I worked on localizing the hints that also use binding sprites, and ensuring they'd update when a binding changes. Since the move hint is a special component to account for multiple bindings, I worked on localizing that next. Then I ran through the tutorial with the locale in Spanish to ensure I had tackled all the spots. One of the pieces of feedback I received a while ago was related to revealing the map slowly as you unlock levels. For the system, I created an interface that determines whether a milestone has been reached or not. Different milestones will have different rules. The world map will then use a component and ask it to evaluate milestones based on the current progression. The first milestone to be reached will fire an event. As milestones complete, the idea is that parts of the map will start to be revealed. I will have to reconsider the unlock rules so at least some of the newly revealed levels are accessible when the milestone is reached. To test the map reveal idea, I created a button that marks a milestone complete. To tie the idea together, I then tested that once a milestone is complete, the evaluation fires properly if the next milestone is reached. Another piece of feedback I received from the last playtest was to explore adding a small amount of story. I decided to combine this with the milestone system, which would play a little bit of dialogue before the next area is revealed. This is fairly similar to the way new areas are revealed in Pokemon Snap. A while ago, I bought a dialogue system asset on a Unity sale, so I decided to try learning it instead of making my own. I followed their tutorial and got something working that was localized using the localization package. Since I want to control when the dialogue fires, I had to set up assembly definitions in order to call the dialogue system's triggers from my script. This let me invoke the onUse event when I wanted it to. Another part I wanted to figure out was setting up data so the dialog system displays text that comes from a variable. This will be used to display the Steam name for the player. Having figured things out, I proceeded to combine the milestone system and the test dialog conversation, making a milestone initiate the dialog when it is reached. The tutorial dialog will give the player a choice to go to the tutorial or skip it, so I had to learn how to set up events to fire based on the different choices. That's it for this devlog. My focus for the next part will be create the dialog UI, create dialog for the start and first world, update the map reveal logic, updates to the pause panel. If you want to support me, please visit the Don't Drown store page linked in the description and add the game to your wishlist. Until next time.